These three true Halloween horror stories are inspired by real events. These accounts come from a lifelong cemetery groundskeeper, a police deputy who turned in his badge, and a husband who heard the one sound he prayed he never would. First, a skeptic spends decades trying to debunk a local ghost story, only to find irrefutable proof on a security camera's corrupted file. Then, a terrifying scream from beneath the earth leads a journalist not to a ghost, but to a secret experiment and a warning to stop digging. And finally, a 19th century husband honors his wife's final fear with a safety coffin, only to be forced to listen as the bell from her grave rings for 3 horrifying nights. The most terrifying sounds aren't the screams you hear in the dark. They're the ones that suddenly stop. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. For over 30 years, Julian had worked the grounds of a quiet, sprawling cemetery on the north shore of Illinois. He knew its secrets, not the spooky kind, but the real kind. He knew which headstones would lean after a hard rain, which paths held water, and which of the ancient oak trees would drop their branches in a high wind. He'd started the job a young man, back when he thought the world made perfect sense. Now, in the early 1990s, his hands were stained with dirt, and his beliefs were just as simple. He believed in what he could see, touch, and fix with a shovel. Every Halloween, the stories would start up again. New security guards, mostly kids, would get spooked by a shadow and start whispering about the woman in white. Julian would hear them as he made his rounds, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel path the only thing he needed to hear. He'd just shake his head. In 30 years, every strange noise had turned out to be a branch, an animal, or the wind. He dealt in facts. The night before Halloween, Julian was near the main gates doing a final check. The old streetlights overhead gave off their usual weak yellow light. That's when he saw her. Down the path, a woman in a long white dress standing near the oldest mausoleums. He figured she was a visitor who'd gotten turned around and was trying to find her way out after closing. He called out to her, but she just turned and walked quickly into the shadows between the stone buildings. He went to go check, but she was gone. He just shrugged. Kids sometimes dared each other to sneak in. He figured she'd hopped a fence and ran off when she heard him coming. He didn't think twice about it. The next night, Halloween, the wind was making a racket, a low moan that rattled the leaves. Julian was in the same spot near the gates when he saw a figure. He froze. It was the same woman, same white dress, same spot. A little chill went down his spine. He called out again, his voice sharp this time. She didn't respond. He started walking toward her, his heavy work boots loud on the gravel. But the closer he got, the stranger things felt. She turned toward the shadows, just like the night before. But this time, she didn't walk. She glided into the darkness with a speed that wasn't humanly possible. Julian rushed to where he'd seen her. But when he got there, the place where she'd vanished, the wind just stopped. 1 second it was howling. The next, there was nothing. A complete heavy silence fell over the area. It felt wrong, like the air had turned to wool, muffling everything. The only sound left was the hard, fast thump of his own heart against his ribs. Seeing her once was nothing, but seeing her again, and the way she moved, that was something else entirely. He called Margaret, the cemetery manager. She was a practical woman who ran the place with ledgers and hard facts. In the brightly lit office, she could see he was rattled. He told her what happened, starting with the woman he'd seen the night before, the one he'd dismissed. Then he told her about seeing the exact same woman again, about the impossible way she moved, and the impossible quiet that followed. Margaret listened, wrote it all down, and filed it in the logbook under nighttime weather disturbance. She told Julian he'd been working too hard, but the fact it happened twice had put a new, cold feeling in Julian's gut. Julian's story wasn't the last one. Over the next 10 years, a pattern started to form, one entry at a time in the office logbook. Little things, all of them easy to dismiss on their own. One of the younger groundskeepers swore he heard someone whisper his name on the wind, so faint he thought he'd imagined it. A security guard saw a flicker of white in his headlights as he drove past the gates, a movement so quick it was like a trick of the eye. Another reported a sudden deep cold settling over his car on a warm summer night, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and fogged up his windows from the inside. Margaret's logbook filled up with practical explanations. Electrical malfunction for flickering lights near the gate. Sudden temperature drop for the guard's strange chill. High winds causing auditory illusions. But all the reports kept happening in the same area. The woman in white was no longer a story Julian told. She was becoming a file, a collection of documented problems that had no sensible solution. By the late 1990s, the cemetery had a brand new security camera system. The night guard was a young guy named Edward, a kid who believed in technology. He trusted hard drives and digital proof more than ghost stories. He was watching the monitor for the main gate one night, drinking coffee to stay awake, when he saw it. A blurry shape that moved across the screen. It was faint, almost transparent, and it moved in a jerky, unnatural way, like the camera couldn't quite keep up with it. Edward's heart hammered in his chest. He fumbled for a thumb drive, jamming it into the recording deck. He managed to copy a few seconds of the feed before the screen filled with static and the word glitch appeared in block letters. He ripped the drive out and ran to find Julian. They watched it together on an old office laptop. The video was grainy. It showed a few frames of a shimmering, indistinct shape gliding past the gate before the image dissolved into a mess of digital snow. For Edward, the glitch was the terrifying part. For Julian, seeing it on a screen, captured by a machine, was all the proof he ever needed. They called Margaret in. She watched the short clip 3 times. Her face went pale, not with fear, but with the frustration of seeing something her practical mind couldn't process. Edward kept saying, "It wasn't a glitch. It was saving a file." That's what it was doing. Saving a file Margaret had no explanation. The file, corrupted as it was undeniable. Julian's skepticism was gone for good. It hadn't been replaced with fear, but with a strange kind of certainty. He knew some things just didn't have answers. When the next Halloween came, he decided to wait for her. He went to the main gate alone, carrying a new digital video recorder. The wind died and every cricket went silent. The world seemed to be holding its breath. In that sudden quiet, he heard a sound. It was a low, steady tone, like a single, sad note being held somewhere far away. And she appeared, closer than ever before. Her white dress seemed to catch the moonlight. She looked right at him. Her face was perfectly clear. It wasn't angry or frightening. It was just filled with a deep, endless sorrow. She raised a hand toward him, as if she was asking for something. A feeling washed over Julian, a powerful wave of sadness that wasn't his own. It was a heavy, cold weight that settled on his shoulders, a feeling of loss so immense it made his own life feel small. He didn't feel scared. He just stood there, the recorder in his hand, and watched her. She held his gaze for a moment, then slowly backed away into the shadows and disappeared. The wind started up again and the low, sad tone was gone. Julian looked down at the recorder in his hand. The red light was still on. It had been working perfectly the whole time. But when he played it back, there was nothing. The screen just showed the empty gate and a few leaves blowing across the path. The microphone had recorded only the sound of the wind. Later, in the office, Margaret laid everything out on her desk. The logbook with a decade of strange reports, Edward's corrupted video file, and now Julian's final, empty recording. They didn't talk about stress or tricks of the light anymore. They had a case file on the impossible, a documented history of something they would never understand. The legend of the woman in white was no longer a story told by kids to spook each other. It was a quiet, documented fact. A presence proven not by a scream, but by a strange silence and a digital glitch. The cemetery was still a place of work for Julian, but now he knew he wasn't just a groundskeeper. He was the archivist for a ghost. He had looked for a rational explanation and, in its place, had found a legend that all the evidence told him was true. Patrolling a cemetery wasn't the job Deputy Graham imagined when he joined the force. Halloween night, 1978, and his beat was a silent city of stone out in the desolate stretches of southeast Idaho. He was young, sure of the world, and this assignment felt like a punchline. He swept his flashlight over the cold markers, each one a monument to a story that was long over. To him, this was just a place, a plot of land where things ended. His partner for the shift was a groundskeeper named Monroe, a man who seemed to have been there for 40 years and would likely be there for 40 more. Monroe moved with a quiet purpose, his silence a part of the landscape. "Just keep your wits about you," the old man had advised earlier, his voice a low rumble. "Tonight's the night this place remembers it has a reputation." Graham just gave a tight smile. A reputation was why he was here officially. Being the newest deputy, he'd drawn the short straw after a few scattered reports of trespassing had come in over the last month. His sergeant had called them disturbances, but clearly thought it was just local kids. "Go check it out, rookie," his boss had said. So here he was, a glorified security guard for a ghost story. He was a man who trusted what he could see and write in a report, not local legends about a gateway to hell. Monroe stopped. "This is the spot," he said, his light settling on a plain patch of earth. "It always starts here." A feeling of profound wrongness washed over Graham. It wasn't just the chill in the air, it was a deep internal cold that logic couldn't touch. The distant sounds of civilization seemed to vanish, replaced by a strange pressure building in his ears. The town's church bell began to toll in the distance, marking midnight. It started as a low, indistinct murmur from under the ground. Then the sound that would derail Graham's life rose from the earth. It was a scream, a raw, inhuman shriek of pure agony that tore through the air. It didn't sound like it came from a person or an animal. It sounded like the ground itself was in pain. Graham's blood ran cold. He fumbled for his radio, his voice a dry rasp. "Dispatch, we have a disturbance. Source unknown." When other deputies arrived, there was nothing. The sound was gone. The air was just air. Graham saw the knowing looks and patient smiles. It was a Halloween prank to them. His official report was logged with a simple, dismissive note. No source found. After they left, the real fear began. A sudden gust of wind slammed a metal gate shut with a deafening clang. Pockets of intense cold seemed to drift past them in the dark. A wrench slid off a nearby toolbox and hit the ground with a sharp crack. When Graham finally decided to leave, his truck's engine sputtered once and died. It wouldn't turn over. One day later, Graham turned in his badge. His resignation letter offered no clear reason, just a reference to an experience he could not explain. The file was closed. Years passed until a journalist named Lena started digging into the legend in the early 1980s. In the county archives, she found the pattern of Halloween reports. In the Historical Society, she found the resignation letters. One letter from an old groundskeeper mentioned seeing vehicles on the access road at odd hours. This was the first detail that didn't fit the ghost story. Her interview with the now haunted Graham confirmed the terror, but it was that one detail, the strange vehicles, that began to shift her focus from the supernatural to the secret. Armed with this suspicion, Lena went to the cemetery on Halloween night. She found Monroe, who just gave her a slow, knowing nod. At midnight, the screaming started, just as the report said. It was horrifying, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul. Lena searched frantically in the dark with a flashlight, but found nothing. No speakers, no wires, no source. Just the cold ground and the terrible sound. She left frustrated but not defeated. An entire year went by. Lena's investigation hit a wall. There were no public records connecting the cemetery to any suspicious activity. The story went cold, but she didn't let it go. The next Halloween, she returned. Again, Monroe was there, a silent sentinel. The church bell tolled midnight, and the screaming began. This time, Lena didn't run towards it. She stayed hidden, watching, listening. The inhuman wail went on for nearly 10 minutes, then abruptly stopped. In the ringing silence that followed, Lena saw it. A flicker of movement near the plot Monroe had pointed out to Graham years ago. She moved closer, staying in the shadows of the old stones. 2 men were there, dressed in dark work clothes. They were packing up equipment, not shovels, but strange-looking electronic devices and spools of cable. They moved with a quick, disciplined efficiency. Lena stepped out of the shadows. "What was that sound?" she asked, her voice steady. The 2 men froze. They looked at each other, a quick, alarmed glance. They said nothing, simply hastening their work, packing the last of the gear into heavy-duty cases. Lena took another step forward. "I was here last year," she prodded. "I heard it then, too." One of the men stopped. He was young, fit, with a high and tight military haircut. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "Do not come around here again," he said, his tone low and absolute. He picked up the last case. "This is off limits for local military authorities." Without another word, they turned and disappeared into the darkness. Lena stood frozen in the sudden, heavy silence. The truth settled in her gut, cold and hard. This wasn't a ghost story. It was something worse. It was human. She didn't know what the experiment was, what those screams really were, or why it was happening in this forgotten place. She only knew what she had seen. Disciplined men with strange equipment, and a warning that felt less like a threat and more like a line being drawn. She understood in that moment that she would never get any more answers. To keep digging would be to invite a kind of attention she could not handle. Lena got in her car, drove away from that cemetery, and never returned. The story she had uncovered never saw the ink of a printing press. It became a tale told in quiet, hushed tones to a few close friends who would listen. For all she knew, the screaming stopped for good that night. Or perhaps it didn't. Lena would never know for sure. She had looked behind a curtain that was never meant to be lifted, and she had seen enough. It was late October, 1863, up in northern Maine. The air was cold, the kind that got right into your bones and stayed there. It carried the smell of wet dirt and dying leaves, the official scent of any graveyard getting ready for winter. This was a quiet, lonely place, but that fall, It became the setting for a story that people around here still don't like to tell after dark. It's the story of Genevieve, a young woman who was pronounced dead from an illness nobody could name. One minute she was breathing, the next she was still. So still, the family doctor said she was gone. For most, that would be the end of the story. But for her husband, a man named Blackwood, it was the beginning of a whole new kind of fear. Back then, the fear of being buried alive was a real and terrible thing. Stories were everywhere, whispered from town to town, of people waking up in the dark 6 feet under. Blackwood couldn't get those stories out of his head. He refused to let Genevieve be put in a simple box. He paid extra for what they called a safety coffin. It was a strange thing. Looked like any other coffin, but it had a small brass bell mounted on the lid, right above the ground. A cord ran from that bell down through the wood and was placed in the hands of the person inside. The idea was simple. If you woke up, you pulled the cord, you rang the bell, you were saved. Most folks thought it was a waste of money, just playing on fear. Blackwood didn't care. They buried her on Halloween night. The few people there moved like ghosts in the fading light. The coffin went into the ground, and the sound of shovels scraping and dumping dirt was the only noise. The final thud of dirt on the lid felt heavy. Final. Blackwood himself placed a small lantern by the headstone. Its little flame flickered, a tiny spot of light in the growing darkness. He just stood there, staring at that little bell, his wife's only connection to the world of the living. The first night fell, and a young groundskeeper named Thorne was on watch. He was new to the job, still getting used to the deep silence and the long shadows the moon cast through the crooked trees. The only sound was the steady crunch of his own boots on the gravel path. A cold wind moved through the pine trees, making a low sighing sound. As he passed the new grave, he heard something else. It was a tiny metallic sound, a single faint tink. He stopped dead. The sound was so small he thought he'd imagined it. He listened, holding his breath, but heard nothing more than the wind. He figured it was just the new rope settling, or a twig falling on the bell. He tried to put it out of his mind, but it stayed with him. Later that night, he mentioned it to his boss, an old, hard-faced man named Augustus. Augustus just let out a short, barking laugh. "The wind plays tricks on you out here, boy," he grumbled, not even looking up from his desk. "Get back to your rounds." The second night was colder. The wind was sharper. Thorne did his patrol, trying his best to stay away from the new grave, but he knew he had to check the grounds. As he got closer, he heard it again. This time it wasn't a trick. It was a clear, deliberate sound carried on the wind. Ding, ding. A pause, then another. Ding. It was weak, but it was real. A cold feeling washed through him, sharp and unpleasant. This was not the wind. Someone was ringing that bell. He ran to find Augustus, his heart pounding against his ribs. He explained what he heard, how it was a clear signal this time. The old man slammed his hand down on his desk, his face turning red with anger. "I've worked in this cemetery for 30 years, Augustus snarled. "I've heard every bump and whistle the night has to offer. It's nothing. If I hear one more word from you about fairy tales and ringing bells, you'll be looking for a new job come morning. Do you understand me?" Thorne just nodded, the cold feeling in his gut getting worse. He walked away, feeling trapped. He went back out, pulled by a force he didn't understand. From across the cemetery, he saw a dark figure standing by Genevieve's grave. It was Blackwood. The husband had come back, and as Thorne watched, he saw Blackwood's head snap up, looking around in the darkness. He had heard it too. Their eyes met across the field of stone markers. They didn't say a word, but in that one look they shared the same terrible knowledge. The sound was real. By the third night, the sound was no longer quiet or timid. It was a frantic, desperate clamor. The bell was ringing without pause, a constant, high-pitched peal that cut through the silence of the cemetery. It was the sound of pure panic. Blackwood was there, and he'd brought a few other family members with him. They begged Augustus and the cemetery director to do something, to dig her up. The director was a man who cared more about rules than anything else. He refused to disturb a grave in the dead of night. They would wait, he said, until morning. As the small crowd stood there in the freezing dark, forced to listen to the non-stop ringing, the sound seemed to get louder, faster, a frantic heartbeat from beneath the earth. It was a scream you could hear. And then, all at once, it stopped. The sudden silence was more horrifying than the ringing had ever been. It was a deep, total quiet that felt like an answer. The air grew heavy and still. There was nothing left to do but wait for the sun. As the first weak, gray light of morning finally broke through the trees, the diggers arrived. Their faces were grim. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, their voices low whispers. The only real sounds were the hard scrapes of the shovels hitting dirt and rock, and the heavy breathing of the men as they worked. They finally lifted the coffin out of the earth, its wooden sides caked in mud. Blackwood fell to his knees beside it, his hands shaking as he helped pry open the lid. What they saw inside was a nightmare. The soft satin lining of the coffin was torn to shreds. The wood on the inside of the lid was covered in deep scratches, splintered and raw. Genevieve's fingernails were broken and bloody. The bell cord was pulled tight and wrapped around her hand, which was frozen in a desperate grip. Her body was twisted into a position that spoke of a terrible, violent struggle. She had not died peacefully. Dr. Whitlock arrived soon after. He was a man of science, calm and professional, but when he looked into the coffin, he physically recoiled. The proof was right there. His formal examination later confirmed what everyone who saw her already knew. Genevieve had been alive when she was buried. The state of her body and the inside of the coffin showed she had fought for air, for escape, for at least 2 days before finally suffocating in the dark. The story of what happened on those 3 nights became a legend, a grim warning whispered in the town for generations. The other safety coffins in the cemetery were quietly removed. They didn't need a bell to remind them of the horrors that can lie buried just beneath your feet.